Now, I'm not trying to convert you all to 8-frame boxes necessarily just to overwinter your bees, but I do think they overwinter better in 8-frame boxes. But your back will thank you. The cost of converting all your beekeeping to 8-frame medium boxes is probably less than your back surgery is going to cost after you screw up your back. You know, there's two kinds of beekeepers. There's beekeepers with bad backs and beekeepers who will have bad backs. So, and then I run into these people all the time who are young and say, well, I'm young and strong, I can handle these 90-pound boxes. And I think, you know, when I first screwed up my back, I think I was 24. You don't have to be old to mess up your back. I think that's a misunderstanding. Yes?
So what are some of the ways that you can transition? So like if you have an 8-frame bee, how do you do that? Because you have all of the frames. They're all either honey or... So how do you make that transition from switching?
From which? From
the deep to the medium.
Deeps to mediums?
Yeah.
Well, I assume part of the question is, there's probably two parts to this question, but part of the question is, currently the bees are on these combs and I want to get them on these combs. Well, you're going to harvest honey anyway now and then, so you can harvest all the honey. You can, once you've got any frame that's a medium that has brood on it, you can put the queen with that frame of brood on the other side of the excluder from the rest of it. Once all the brood emerges, you can harvest all that honey, and now you've got the bees off of the comb. The other part of the question, I guess, is what do you do with all these frames? Well, once they're clean and dry, I assume you harvested them and gave them back to them as wets, and they cleaned them all up, and now you've got dry, empty comb. I run them all through the table saw at 6 1/4 inches, and then run the end bars through the table saw with a fence of 3/8 of an inch, and then make a butt joint with the bottom bar to the end bar, and I've got a medium frame. So I just cut all the frames down to mediums. And the boxes are pretty easy. If they're rabbited, you've got to watch out for nails, but if they're the kind with the box joints on them, which for some reason beekeepers all call dovetails, which they're not, but box joint, the medium, usually it lands exactly right on the joint and you won't even hit the nail. It's not even a problem. You just run it through the table saw and saw it off at 6 5/8. So it's easy to cut them down from deeps to mediums, and it's easy to cut the frames down from deeps to mediums. It's harder to cut the 10-frame boxes to 8 frames, but I did that too. I cut all my 10-frame boxes down to 8 frames. But if you're not handy with a table saw, the other way you can get rid of all your deep stuff is just sell the bees to somebody else on deeps, and then make splits and sell them in splits until all of them are gone. That's another way to do it. I think the first thing you want to do, though, and I have trouble. Some things are so obvious that people can't see them. Maybe that's how I should say that. People will say, well, I want to end up with 8-frame mediums, but I'm going to keep buying 10-frame deeps because that's what I'm already using. Why? Why don't you start buying what you really want, and eventually you can worry about what you're going to do with the stuff you don't want. But I would stop buying anything you don't want now, because I can put 8-frame boxes on top of 10-frame boxes, and I can put mediums on top of deeps. There's no interchangeability problem here. You take a 1x3 and cut it 20 inches, and you can now put any 8-frame box on top of any 10-frame box, and just throw that 1x3 on the side, and you can stack them up any way you want. So the first step would be to stop buying what you don't want. The next step would be to start converting over and trying to get them on the equipment you want, and decide what you want to do with the other equipment. I hesitate to tell everybody to cut all their stuff down, because if you know how to run a table saw, it's a great thing. I think a table saw is one of the most dangerous tools ever invented, and I hate to recommend somebody cut all this stuff down on a table saw and then they lose a finger. It's not worth losing a finger over. Just sell the equipment. So, of course, they do make a table saw out there now that supposedly you can't cut your finger off even if you tried, because it will shut the saw down immediately. I don't know if I totally trust it for that, but it might be worth the money. I mean, your fingers are, what are your fingers worth? So anyway, I hesitate to tell everybody to cut all their stuff down like I did because I don't know how good they are at being safe with a table saw. If you want to learn to run a table saw, which is a good skill to have, probably your local community college has a woodworking class, and they'll teach you all the safety rules of how to run a table saw. But even then, I used to work with an old carpenter. He was probably my age now, then, and I was probably 19, and he didn't lose his thumb, but he ran his thumb through the table saw and took a piece out of right here, but he was always following all the safety rules, and he only had the saw sticking up a little bit past the wood. Was the only reason he didn't lose his thumb. But he did that at 66, and he'd been running a table saw since he was 16. That's when he started doing carpentry and started building cabinets. And so, you know, he had 50 years experience, and he still did it. So it's just a dangerous tool. It just takes one split second of not thinking what you're doing, and you're hurt. Kicking back is the other thing that does it, because something gets in a bind and it kicks back, and you know, it can kick back hard enough to run you through with something. So it's a dangerous tool, but if you want to learn the rules of how to run one safely, probably your local community college has a woodworking class, and you can go take that and learn how to run one. I think the other secret is, though, I bought the cheapest little table saw I could find. I think I paid 60 bucks for it brand new at Home Depot, and it was on sale for a Christmas special. But it's a weak little thing, and that sounds like that would be bad, but it used to be I thought I'd want a big, strong table saw, but the more I've run one, the more I think I'd rather have a weak one, because at worst, if I get in a bind, it kind of just stops the blade, and then that immediately blows the reset button on the motor, and it stops. Where on a big, strong one, it would have kicked back and probably done me some damage. So maybe a small, wimpy, cheap table saw is better than a big, strong one. But anyway, you can, other ways you can, I guess I tend to use a mixture of things when I'm trying to get these off of one kind of equipment onto another. So it depends on how much of what I have. So I can feed mediums into a deep box, but they're going to build a little extra comb on the bottom, and then I can cut it off and rubber band it into frames. I often do that to get some brood on a frame that I can put with the queen on the other side of the excluder. Because if I put the queen on the other side of the excluder with no brood, sometimes they'll abandon her and raise another queen. And so I need some brood with her, even if it's just one frame, just something with her, so that they'll realize, oh, this is the brood nest now. So there's that, and then you can actually put deeps in two mediums. You can stick deep in two mediums if you're trying to. I just got one deep left over, and I don't know what else to do with it. I try not to do a lot of that kind of stuff, but if I just got one frame here and there that I need to put somewhere, I can put a medium in a deep box, and I can put a deep in two medium boxes. And I can do cutouts. I can cut the comb out and rubber band it into a medium frame, and I can, so I kind of play it by ear. You know, if I got this one leftover comb I need to do something with, then the other thing is the more colonies you have, the more I can say, okay, I got 2 or 3 left over, and I got 2 or 3 from this one, and I'll put all them together and put them over here. Meanwhile, every time I get another deep frame out of there, I'm getting closer to where I want it to be. If that makes sense?
It does. Thank you.
So why does an A-frame do better in the winter? Well, the cluster tends to fill the colony. I don't know how many of you have ever read Ave Warre's book on which the Warre hive is based, but he experimented with sizes and pretty much came to the conclusion that about a 14-inch box was about the right size for the cluster of bees, which is pretty much what a A-frame medium is. It's 13 3/4 if you're buying one from this part of the country, and 14 inches if you're buying one from Man Lake. But it's pretty much the right width for the cluster. So the cluster doesn't tend to leave a bunch of honey behind when it moves up, because it pretty much fills the boxes and they eat it all as they go. So I'm not saying you can't overwhelm them in 10-frame boxes, but they probably do better than 8-frame boxes. And I think they do better in medium boxes, because the cluster almost always spans more than one box, and you've got this horizontal gap between the boxes, so the bees can expand and contract the cluster easily and easily move from one frame to the next by that gap in the middle. Where on deeps, if they're clustered in the middle of the deeps, they can't easily move from frame to frame. They have to go leave the cluster, go up over the top, and move to the next frame. And once in a while, I've seen a sudden cold snap. I end up with a bunch of bees that got trapped over here and couldn't contract, and they died from the cold. So I think the mediums actually for the winter better than the deeps. I run narrow frames, and I think the narrow frames over the winter, mostly they build up better in the spring, but the normal Hoffman frame is 1 3/8 inches. And if bees are building their own brood comb, they build them 1 1/4 inches on the centers. So if you narrow the frames to 1 1/4 inches instead of 1 3/8 inches, one of the benefits you get is that it takes less bees to cover the same amount of brood. So when they start building up in the spring, it takes half as many bees to cover the same amount of brood, so they can raise a lot more brood a lot quicker in the spring and are less likely to get caught with not being able to keep it warm on the narrow frames. The other thing that happens with narrow frames is you get smaller cells, and when you get smaller cells, you have a higher density of bees for the same square inches of comb. You've got more bees in that amount of space because they're smaller cells. The other thing you get with smaller cells is you get a shorter gestation cycle. So you're getting 18 to 19 days instead of 21 days. And that doesn't sound that significant, but when it comes to varroa mite reproduction, it's 1/3 of the varroa mite reproduction of the 21-day cycle. But also, they can build up faster because it's only 18 days for the next batch of brood to come around instead of 21. That's really pretty big when it happens over and over and over again, and every time it's 2 days shorter. Pretty major. So anyway, I think the narrow frames work a lot better. That's what I was doing all that table saw work that I got my lungs all clogged up here. And then, like I said, they build smaller cells because of the narrow frames, but you can also buy small cell foundation, and you can also buy, Manlink makes a one-piece plastic frame and foundation that's small cell. They also make one that's large cell, but the PF120s and PF100s are small cell. And again, the small cell takes less bees to cover the same amount of brood, and so they build up faster in the spring, and you solve a lot of your varroa problems. So every time I turn around, somebody's trying to winter their bees inside, and I'm not saying it can't be done, but basically you're taking responsibility for everything when you do that. When the bees are outside, they get to make adjustments. They can fly when it's warm, they cannot fly when it's not warm, they can raise brood when they think it's a good idea, they cannot raise brood when they don't think it's a good idea. As soon as you start raising them indoors, you have to control everything. And you better get it right, because if you don't, they'll all die. So indoor wintering can be done. If you want to do it, I would talk to the people who've been doing it and read everything you can and watch everything you can. By the Ian Stepler is a Canadian beekeeper who's got a bunch of YouTube videos on how he overwinters them indoors. I would study those in great detail if you want to attempt it. But I think it's kind of a waste of time in your location. I think it's probably a waste of time in my location, though I keep kicking it around. I'm not so interested in doing it to overwinter regular colonies as I am, but I'd like to overwinter a bunch of single 8-frame boxes with a queen in them, so I have a bunch of queens in the spring. So I keep kicking it around because I can raise a bunch of queens this time of year, and nobody wants them this time of year. And if I can get them through the spring, then I have some queens to sell. So I'm kind of interested in it. Overwintering an observation hive. Observation hives are kind of boom or bust anyway. So if you want to try and overwinter an observation hive, you want to try and time your management so that they peak out pretty well in the fall and they have a good population going into winter. And then you're probably going to have some way you can feed them both syrup and pollen all winter, so that they can raise a few batches of brood during the winter. Because because otherwise they're probably going to dwindle too much by spring to get back on their feet. Sometimes they still dwindle too much by spring, and then if you give them a boost of bees, maybe they'll get back on their feet. But managing observation hives is tricky anyway, because it tends to, the population explodes and then they swarm, or it just dwindles and they can't seem to get on their feet because they're always struggling because they don't have much space to start with. So you can manage them. Here's what I would do though. I plan on having pollen to feed them, and I plan on feeding them a little bit of pollen at least after the winter solstice on, and probably syrup anytime you think that it might be of use to them, but especially from the winter solstice on to try and stimulate them to raise brood. Because my observation hive is always in my living room, so they're 7 degrees. So the main trigger to get them to raise brood is the solstice, not the temperature. It's that the days are getting longer, and that's what makes them want to raise brood. So I want to make sure they can do that, because if they don't, there's just not going to be enough bees that will make it all the way to spring. So that's my list of criteria. It's basically a synopsis of the list I gave at the beginning. I probably should come to this. So I've encoded my email address there because, like I said, all these presentations are online, and they got these email robots out there that keep trying to glean email addresses, and so I encode it because otherwise I get all these emails from these Russian women who all think I'm the hottest thing ever and want to marry me. And I have a perfectly good wife at home, and I'm not really interested, so I encode it so I don't get like thousands of spam every day. But that's my website. I have a YouTube channel. I haven't posted that many videos myself, but I also have a playlist on there of a lot of these presentations that people have recorded and put out there. I have a Patreon channel if you want to support me financially, and then I have several books, but that's the main book, is The Practical Beekeeper. Any questions? Usually I get some questions.